Hi everyone. So here, my third video, we're going to be talking about Genesis chapters 1 through 3 and sort of the other Near Eastern religions that the creation stories pulled influence from. So to start with, the title Genesis actually means beginning or birth. The Greek writing for Genesis, as it should be noted, it's spelled relatively the same way. There's one extra letter that differentiates between either birth or creation, so that's more or less where the title comes from. And Genesis is the first of 5 books of the Torah, which are the writings of Moses, which I may have talked about beforehand. And with this comes, and I actually need to turn to my last page of notes, comes the idea of bringing up what is called the documentary hypothesis. Now, what this idea, documentary hypothesis is essentially is that there are 4 authors of the 5 books of the Torah. Now, that's not to say that there was one responsible for one responsible for another, but that these were essentially compiled and put together over the period of several centuries. The first author is known as J, which is short for Yahwist, and that ordinarily people might think that, well, wouldn't Yahweh or Yahwist be spelled with a Y? But this idea was formed in Germany, and Yahweh is spelled with a J as opposed to a Y, and that idea implicates that the Yahwist author wrote around 950 BCE in the southern kingdom of Judah. After the J author is the E author, the Elohist author, and the reason they call this author the Elohist author as opposed to the Yahwist author is the J author refers to God as Yahweh, Elohist refers to God as Elohim, and this is presumed to have been written around 850 BCE in the northern kingdom of Israel. P author is the priestly author. This is the author that puts more emphasis on religious tradition and rituals. And it's believed to have been written by someone or a group of someones who were part of the Kohanim priesthood. They were a group of Jewish priests. And this is presumed to have been written during the exile in Babylon around 500 BCE during the exile. The last author is the Deuteronomist, who is responsible purely for Deuteronomy. So that's the only time that we really presume that there was one group of authors for one section of the Torah. And we believe that they wrote that book around 600 BCE during the religious reform in Jerusalem. Now, going back to the beginning of my notes. So chapters 1 through 11 in Genesis focus predominantly on the cosmic origins of the world. And chapters 12 through 50 focus more on the patriarchs, the actual Hebrew traditions that are in the Bible. So it focuses on Abraham, Noah, Isaac, Jacob, and their respective spouses. When we start though, focusing on the actual content that we're talking about today, if you read the creation accounts, and there's two of them, which is another reason that we know that there was more than one author. But 2 of them, in both of them, there's no creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. Instead, there's there's chaos, or there's the planet is just a watery substance. And for the Hebrew words that are used in the introduction, rather than when God started to create, the more correct translation is in the beginning of God's creation. So it gives room for the idea that when we read it, that there is something already there, and that God is creating or is sort of tampering with an already pre-existent chaos, but he's creating something more attuned and more with a purpose, I guess. And there is a 7-day time span between the beginning and end of creation, as we all know. The first day is the lights, second day is the heavens, Third day is the land and plants. Fourth day is the heavenly bodies. Fifth is aquatic life and birds of the air. The sixth day is terrestrial animals and humans. And the seventh day God rests. So there's no independent creation necessarily of man in this, nor is there ever a mention of Adam and Eve. That's actually in the second creation story. And in this one, there's actually a very specific pattern to how God creates. It starts with God said, it was so, God created, it was good. And God creates the cosmos, the heavens, and then the land, etc., etc. And man, or humanity, is the pinnacle of God's creation. Humanity is created to sort of rule over the land and subdue the earth. This creation story, very much parallels the Babylonian epic of Enuma Elish and the god Marduk. So, and how the god Marduk became the chief god of Babylon. So there were these two gods, Apsu and Tiamat. And Apsu was the god of fresh water. Tiamat was the god of salt waters. And this story came about because they needed a way to explain how in Babylon, how over the horizon they could see the fresh waters and the salt waters coming together. Into the Persian Gulf, I should emphasize. So it's the two bodies of water coming together and meeting and going into the Persian Gulf. So Apsu plans to kill all the lesser gods. And when the lesser gods find out about this, they rise up and they kill Apsu. Then Tiamat goes crazy and plans to kill the gods also. Marduk is a lesser god, and he plans to kill Tiamat with the condition that the lesser gods would exalt him over all the others and give him sort of a supreme position, ruling over all of them. And they agree to. So he goes off and he kills Tiamat and finds favor among all the other gods and is exalted above all of them. And in order to thank them, he creates the cosmos. He kills another lesser god named Kingu, who is actually an ally of Tiamat. And he makes humans out of his blood, but not only his blood, but clay as well. And keep that in mind because we're going to come back to that. Now, Tiamat is actually, if you look at the Hebrew word tehom, there's a specific distinction. There's a special reason that those two should go together. Now, in the creation story, God does a lot of things verbally, but God, Yahweh, is a representative of the storm god from the Babylonian epic. And God battles this storm god, Tiamat, who's the god of salt waters, but also the god of the storm god. So God battles the deep, it says in the Hebrew Bible, but actually the word uses tehom, as I said before, and tehom is used more as a title. It's not an adjective. It's not a descriptive word. It's an actual name. So the proper translation would actually be God battles deep with a capital D, not the deep, and it implies that there's another deity there. In chapter 1:2, it actually says that God commands or God speaks, and the deep or deep is settled or is controlled. We see similar instances in Psalm 336, Isaiah 55, 10 through 11, where it mentions that God is creative and powerful and is able to use his words to sort of control things. This also pulls reference from the Egyptian creation myth and the Egyptian creation god Ptah, who creates through what it says, what the heart wants and the tongue commands. If we also look at Psalm 74, 12 through 17, it says, "It was you who drove back the sea, and you broke off the heads of the dragons, crushed the heads off of Leviathan." And this is also mentioned in Job chapter 38, Psalm 104. And in Job 26, it actually says he stilled sea with a capital S with deep, capital D. So again, it implies gods, seems to make a clear distinction that it's talking about the Babylonian gods, specifically Tiamat. Now, also in the Mesopotamian religions, in Babylonian, Marduk, Mesopotamian, Nana, those two gods also create and destroy with their words. Genesis 1:26, which pulls off of that, it appears that there's a clear idea that there's other gods. And for those who seem confused, well, isn't Judaism a monotheistic religion? It actually isn't. It's what's referred to as a henotheistic religion. What that means is they acknowledge other gods, but they only worship one, which is namely Yahweh. But at 1:26 in Genesis, it says, God says, "Let us make humans in our image according to our image." It sort of implies a divine council. We also see this in Job, where God has a divine council. In fact, the character known as the Satan, not Satan, that's a very Christian invention, but the Satan is part of this divine council. So there are other deities that are sort of working with God. 3:22:11:7, yep, there's an assembly of gods. So in Enuma Elish, there is a divine assembly to verify and approve or argue against things that Marduk decides. As I said, we see this in Job 1:6, Psalm 82:1, and Jeremiah 23:18. And there's also a circumlocution to insinuate that there's some level of divinity also with the different lights during the different parts of the day. So in the day, the sun, the greater light rules the day. At night, the lesser light, which is affiliated with the moon, but we now know that the moon doesn't create its own light, but that rules the night. So the second creation story that comes into play, it's not abstract or repetitious, but it does change some words around. So instead of earth and heaven, or it says earth and heaven rather than heaven and earth, it says male and female instead of man and wife, and it refers to the first humans that are created. It says Lord God instead of God. In the first, God is more transcendent. He creates by speaking. He's sort of hidden and separated from man. And in the second one, God is more obtainable. He's much more anthropomorphic than he is in the first creation story. He is a creator. He creates humanity. He creates man, or in this case specifically Adam, out of clay. So he is a potter of humanity. He breathes life into humans. He also plants a garden at 2:8, and he does man's work at 2:15. Now this also parallels humans doing the work of the gods in Enuma Elish. This is part of the reason that that Marduk creates humanity out of Kingu's blood, is because the gods don't want to do some of this lesser work that they view as below them. So he creates humans to do this work that the gods would normally do. There's no 7 days of creation in the second account, but in the first account, first creation story, there's no disobedience, there's no tree of knowledge or divine punishment. But what it all comes down to, if you take both of these stories into account, as different as they are, or very specifically the second one, I guess I should say, because much more of these are emphasized in the second creation story than the first, but it is what's called an etiology. An etiology is basically an origin story. It explains why things are the way they are. It's not a command, it's not an order from God, but it says, like in this case, why we're afraid of snakes, because of the snake, which is not Satan, by the way. That doesn't come into play until Revelation. This explains why we wear clothing. This explains why the sexes are attracted to one another. And we'll get into that in a second. And also why childbearing is painful, life is difficult, and why we die. Now, specifically what I was just talking about, but the sexes attracted to one another, the word for woman in Hebrew is isha, which is very close to the word for man, which is ish. And this possibly also has a parallel in Plato's Symposium, where it talks about an androgynous being split into two. And since then, the two halves try to find each other for the rest of their lives. So there's this parallel in other, not Near Eastern, but in other traditions in other cultures, certainly. But the name for the man, Adam, derives from probably two Hebrew words. One is Adam, which means humanity. The other is Adamah, which refers to the red soil that is found in the Levant. And there's this tradition in other ancient Near Eastern religions where people are created, or humanity is created out of clay. The Egyptian god Khnum forms animals and man from the clay of the land on a potter's wheel, and in Mesopotamia, Atrahasis says that humans are made from a mix of blood and the slain gods with clay. And we talked about this before from Kingu. And talking more about some of the other smaller points. So there's the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we've talked about a number of times, which comes from the 3rd millennium BCE, and that will play a larger role when we get more into the Noah flood story. But it also speaks of giants existing before the flood. Again, it's in Genesis 6. Let's see, in Kindu and Gilgamesh, which are two characters from the Epic of Gilgamesh, obviously. They fight. There's a romantic link between the two. It parallels the Homeric Odyssey story and other Homeric epics, and there's also the story of David and Jonathan, which we will see when we get to the story, the writings in the Book of Kings, later in the Hebrew Bible. It's not the book up, but there's 1 Kings, 2 Kings, etc., etc. Utnapishtim and Horeb also board a ship to avoid God's flood. The ship is given specific instructions for the gods. This should be a point of interest for anyone listening right now. They offer a sacrifice after the flood, and then a snake steals a plant that is meant to return youth, vigor, and divine knowledge to the people who have them. So there's that link there, as well as playing into the Noah story, playing into the second creation story. So the Gilgamesh epic, 3rd millennium BCE, that story plays a pretty heavy hand in the creation story in Genesis. And that's coming maybe 600 or 700 years prior to the Israelites coming together in one land. Also, I have here that Enkidu loses his closeness with nature because of sex with a prostitute. This might play a direct role to the eating of the fruit in the Garden of Eden, because there's an implication that eating fruit is sort of slang for intercourse. We see this at 2 Samuel 19:36 and Isaiah 7:15, where it says something along the lines of to know, but also in Proverbs 30:20 in 9:17, to eat is a euphemism for having sex. This may also be why it's believed that fertility is sort of a God-given thing rather than a natural thing. So that's all I've got for you today. Thank you for watching. I hope this explained a little bit about why we have reason to believe that it wasn't a divinely inspired thing, and why we can see it was taken in sort of copying other Near Eastern stories, creation myths, and so on. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you again.